Bless Fulcher. Nice. Okay, so we're gonna get started pretty soon. I just wanted to give some more people time to get in here. Um, I think we'll start in another minute. And how are you doing, Michi? It's been a while since I've talked to you, but
I know, it's been so long. I'm doing good. Week's almost over. I'm excited for a couple days off.
awesome. That'll be nice. Are
Yeah.
you? Oh yeah, Thanksgiving break. Sweet.
hmm
And what about you, Philip? How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. This is my last commitment before I go off and have a little break for Thanksgiving. So I'm feeling good.
Very
Nice.
cool. Thank you both for coming to speak to us today. For those of you who don't know Michi and Philip, uh, Philip works for Narwhal, and he has been he has volunteered to come give us some training on how to use NX DevTools, which is one of my favorite tools in the Angular community. Um, and then Michi works for Mosaic, and uh, she's also the co-organizer, yeah, co-organizer of the Angular San Diego Meetup, as well as you help out with the Women Who Code Meetup, or are you one of the organizers of that as well?
Yeah, I'm one of the co-directors of the San Diego Network for Women Who Code.
Very cool. And as always, I want to thank our sponsors, Thinkster.io. They offer some amazing courses, and today Thinkster has provided us with a prize, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about that in a second. And as usual, ngconf, I haven't updated this slide. Enterprise NG is not in the future. It actually happened last week. And however, in about 3 months, you will be able to see those videos, which from the main part of the conference, and they will be giving those to the community after 3 months. For those of you who went, you should already be able to go back and look at the videos through that veto program. And let's see, Hero Devs. Hero Devs are specialists who, a lot of them, or all of them, I think, are people who worked on Angular in some fashion, like working on the CLI. So they offer consulting. They'll come into your teams and help provide some really expert advice. So if your companies need some advice or help, or just rockstar Angular developers to help you learn Angular or help you improve your architecture, Hero Devs is always a great choice. So we got a few more people join. I'm on my own today, so bear with me as I perform multiple functions here. Let's see. Brad, welcome, and Craig. Say something if you're cool with showing your video. As a speaker, I can tell you it's nice to be able to see everybody's faces while you're speaking so that you can see when everybody's yelling at you or grimacing or laughing with you, not at you. So if anybody would be willing to share their cameras, let me know. All right, share. I will add you. Promoted to panelist. The only downside is that Zoom will consider you a panelist, which means that you won't get to use the Q&A function. So if you have questions, I'll try to watch the chat and make sure our speakers get your questions at some point. I know way more than I want to about this application at this point. Let's see. Let's see. Alex, you said you're cool with it. And John, number 2. Steven. Craig. That's all right, Jake. Okay. All right. So let me continue. I always like to encourage every Angular developer I know, to check out the Angular show. It's hosted by one of our co-organizers and founders of this meetup, which is Aaron Frost. And him and Jennifer Wadella and Brian F. Love do an excellent job at teaching all things Angular, including history, trivia, skill sets, specific technical things. I think their latest one was, it was operators, that it was RxJS operator creator functions or something like that. And that was very insightful. So check it out and recommend it to your friends. I feel like it's helped me sort of catch up on some of the history that I wasn't paying attention to at the time, or just a lot of insights that I didn't know. And it's also helped me just learn some new things about Angular that are sort of niche, kind of hard to know. All right. If anybody joins, I will. Oh yeah, Stephen, very good point. If I've promoted you to panelist, note that you can change your chat so that it sends it to all panelists and attendees instead of just panelists. Okay, so without further ado, the Angular show, you can get it on Spotify and like pretty much whatever podcast app you can find. So check it out. Or you can go to ng.show. Prizes. So we've been doing this for the last 3 meetups. We've had prizes, and sometimes we just give them away to a random person, except for Steven Nielsen, who wins so many that we stopped giving them to him. And then today we're going to do it based on a quiz that I have prepared before I've heard Philip and Michi's talks. So I might adjust those during the meeting. I probably won't, because I just want to pay attention. But whoever gets the top score and the lowest time on that will get the prize, which is a Thinkster Pro membership for 1 month. It'll be free for you. And that means that any of the content that Thinkster has on it, the learning materials, will be free for you during that month. So you can level up your skills. All right, without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Michi DeWitt, who will be our first speaker. And then Philip Fulcher will follow her. So go ahead, Michi.
Awesome, thank you. As I get started sharing, I would love to know just like what everyone's rough Angular skill level is, just so I can tailor my talk appropriately. So if you don't mind, if you don't want to, that's fine. If you don't mind putting in the panelists and attendees chat, if you're like 1 for like, I'm just learning Angular, 2 for like about intermediate level, and 3, like you're a super advanced Angular user, just so I know what parts of my talk to highlight and which parts to skip. Where did the chat go? All right, I lost the chat. Eric, can you tell me what the chat says?
Oh, so never mind. It's under the more menu.
Yep. Okay. A lot of 2s, couple 1s. All right, perfect. Couple beginners. Eric's a 3. That makes sense. 2.5. Awesome. Okay. Thank you. That's very helpful. All right. So hi. My name is Michi DeWitt. I'm like Eric said, I'm a senior software developer at Mosaic.tech. I also am a co-organizer for Angular San Diego and one of the co-directors for the Women Who Code network in San Diego. I definitely love Eric, of Angular, and really appreciative of Eric for inviting me to come speak today. Today I'm going to be talking about Angular structural directives. So let's dive in, because I'm really bad about speaking about myself. So first, what are directives? Most of you said you're at a 2, so you're going to know what directives are. I'm just going to cover the basics really quickly just to get everyone on the same page. So directives are one of the main building blocks of Angular. They're used to change the appearance or behavior of the DOM, and Angular has 3 different types of directives. The first is a component. Everyone might not know that components are just a special type of directives. They're just directives that have a template. The second type is an attribute directive. Those change the appearance or behavior of the DOM. That's probably what most people think of when they think of directives. And the third are structural directives, and those change the layout of the DOM. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So what are structural directives? Structural directives are a special type of directive, again, like I said, that allow developers to manipulate the DOM by changing the structure. So changing the structure can be adding elements, removing elements, or maybe changing the elements that you already have. Structural directives should always be prefixed with an asterisk. That just gives you as a developer a nice clean way to be looking at your template and know right away that, oh, this is a structural directive. This one's going to change the structure of my DOM. That's not technically and strictly enforced by Angular, but is the best practice. So if you create any of your own custom structural directives, you should definitely use the asterisk. And all of the built-in Angular structural directives will use the asterisk. And you can only add one structural directive to each element. So that's something to be aware of. As we're looking at directives throughout this talk, we're going to be looking at ngIf and ngFor. You couldn't put both of those on the same element. You'd have to split them up onto different elements. And then most directives work by manipulating the structure based on values in your component. And because of this, that makes them really useful in dynamic applications, because it allows you to change the structure based on content in your application. So you can change it based on each specific user or maybe the actions of your users. So how do you use structural directives? Really easy. It's just like adding, using an attribute directive. You're going to add it as an attribute on any element in your Angular template. So in this example above, we have a directive called SumDirective. We can immediately see it because it has that asterisk in front of it, and we're adding it to our div. So right away, because it has an asterisk, we know that SumDirective is going to manipulate the structure of my DOM because it's a structural directive. You can also bind properties to your directive, just like you could bind properties to an attribute directive. So in this case, we have some other directive. Again, the asterisk in front lets us know right away that's a structural directive. We're binding it to a property called SumProperty in your component. So that allows you to, again, bind values from your component directly to the directive, so the directive can use it in whatever calculations it does. But these examples are all pretty vague, so let's get specific. So we're gonna focus today on two built-in structural directives that Angular provides out of the box. And the first one we're going to talk about today is ngIf. So what is ngIf? Again, most of you shared that you're at level 2, so you're most if not all of you will know this already. But just again, to make sure we're all on the same page, the ngIf directive is used to conditionally add or remove elements from your DOM. So it's going to bind to a condition, which is, and based on the value of that condition, the element that the directive is added to is either going to be added to the DOM or removed from the DOM if the element was already added previously. It's almost identical to the ngIf directive in AngularJS. So if you're coming from the AngularJS world to Angular, this is going to be really familiar to you. So basically all that is to say, you add ngIf to things that you want to sometimes be in your DOM and sometimes not. So let's talk about how that works. So when components first initialized, any ngIf that's added to your template, it's the condition is going to be checked and evaluated. And if the condition evaluates to a truthy value, then whatever element that directive is added to is going to be added to your DOM. And so in this example here, if some condition evaluated to truthy, then in your DOM, you would see the words, I want to show this if some condition is truthy. But if some condition evaluates to falsy, then this div is not going to be added to your DOM at all. It's just going to be completely removed or completely not added. Then as your data changes in your directive, or sorry, in your component, if the value of that condition changes, so example, say it was truthy before, something's changed in your data, and now some condition evaluates to falsy, that div that says I want to show this if some condition is truthy is going to be completely removed from the DOM. Or if before that div was never added because some condition evaluated to falsy, that div is now going to be added to your DOM. So this is really powerful because it lets you, again, add and remove content from your DOM based on conditions in your component. The really smart thing about how they built the ngIf syntax is that it maps really closely to JavaScript. So any developers that are maybe not new to JavaScript but are new to Angular, should be able to pick up the syntax of the ngIf really easily, and it's pretty easy and intuitive to use. So you can see here in JavaScript, we have if some condition, and then we execute that code in the block, right? If we look back at how the ngIf directive is used, we add ngIf. If that some condition is true, then again, that entire block is going to be used or going to be added to your DOM. So this syntax makes it pretty easy for most people, regardless of their Angular skill level, to start using ngIf right away without a lot of mental overhead. And I want to highlight that part about how it's added or removed from the DOM, because this is really the key part of the power of the ngIf directive. By adding and removing, rather than just hiding and showing, we have a lot of power of only initializing components when we need them and being able to destroy components when they're no longer needed. This may not seem like something that matters too much if you're just showing text, right? In my example, I was just showing a simple line of text that said this will be added if some condition is true. But imagine that your ngIf is being added to a div that contains a table or a component that shows a table. And whenever that component is initialized, it has to grab a lot of data from the server, parse that data, show all the rows in that table. If you're only hiding that when you don't need it, it's still going to go through all that work of grabbing the data from the server, parsing that data, maybe even trying to build all the rows when you don't even need it, right? You don't want to show it, it's being hidden. So using something like ngIf, where we're actually just going to remove that completely, gives you a lot more power to not make those expensive calls. And again, if you want to, maybe it was showing at one point, you change the value of ngIf to falsy, but you remove it. Now you get to destroy that component. You get to free up that memory that that component was holding. So adding and removing is a lot more powerful than just showing and hiding. Some of the best cases to use ngIf, but these are not the only cases, are one, if you want to add or remove content based on actions of a user. So kind of that example I was talking about before, you have like a table that you want to show or hide with the click of a button. You could bind that condition to a flag that's like, show or hide, and add or remove that table based on that action. You may also want to add or remove content based on some configuration value. So maybe you have a trial version of your application. Part of the configuration, or maybe one of the user properties that comes in, is that your user is only a trial user. So you can use ngIf to just not add any maybe enterprise or premium features that you have in your application. Or you can also add or remove content based on values in your component. So a good example here is if you have an error message. You don't want to show an error message to your user all the time if there's no error, because that would be very confusing and not a very good UI or UX. So you probably only want to show an error when something has happened that's wrong. So maybe they're filling out a form and they missed a value, something like that. You can use ngIf to conditionally show or hide that error message based on that flag that you have in your component. It looked like I maybe had a question. I'm just going to check the chat real quick.
Oh, no, that was just me.
Okay, cool. So all right, so those are the basic use cases of ngIf. Those are the things that most people probably already know about ngIf if you've been using it. But if you're new to Angular, this may be new information. But let's talk about some of the more advanced uses of ngIf that you might not know right out of the box. So first is the else syntax. It's not uncommon that you might want to display a different template if that condition of your ngIf is falsy. So one thing that you might just like, your knee-jerk reaction, the way to do that is to add a second ngIf. So in this case, you have your first ngIf, which is like if some condition is truthy, you show this. And then if some condition is falsy, then you want to show this other block down here. This is an anti-pattern that I would highly suggest you avoid. A better thing to do is instead use the else syntax. So here we have ngIf some condition else other block. So why is this better? First, this is clean. It's easy to understand. You have a clean logic flow in your template. A user can look, or your other developers can look and say, if some condition, great, this is truthy. And then they immediately know from looking at this ngIf that if some condition is falsy, that something else is going to happen. Something else is going to take the place of this div. And that's not as easily as readily apparent in this example where you're using the not, right? You look at that first div, you just see if some condition is truthy, and it's not immediately clear that there's another div if some condition is falsy. The other nice thing about this is it keeps all of your conditional logic in one single place. So imagine you have to change that logic. in the anti-pattern, you'd have to change it in 2 places, right? There's definitely a high likelihood that you might forget to change that second one. At the very least, it's annoying to have to change it in multiple places. Using the else block means that you keep it in one place, you're less likely to make errors, and it's easier for you to maintain your code. The other nice thing is that the ng template that you have for your else block, you can put anywhere else in your template that makes sense. So you can put it right beneath if you want, but regardless of where you put it, it's going to take the spot of this div. So if your else statement is like some edge case, like maybe it's an edge, it's an error statement. Like if some condition could be like, if loaded, show your page, else show the error statement. And you could just put it so that that error statement is at the bottom of your template. So it's not part of that main logic. This is probably going to be up to whatever the rules of your team are, of how you guys like to structure your code base. But it is nice to have that extra flexibility to really structure your code however you want. And again, just like the if statement, the else syntax has direct similarities to JavaScript, which should make it feel really familiar to developers, and again, make it pretty easy to use. So just like an if statement in JavaScript or Java or C# or wherever you're coming from, most languages will have this. We have if some condition, you execute the block of code in that first curly bracket, and then there's the else, and immediately, if some condition is falsy, you're going to execute this other block. Again, this mirrors really nicely with the ng if else syntax in the Angular directive, because you have if some condition, you're executing this block, else you're going to go find the other block in your template, and that's what's going to be put in place of this div. All right, so the second advanced part of ngIf that we're going to talk about is if you need to store your value. It's, again, not uncommon that you will want to reuse that result of the ngIf condition in multiple places, especially if that ngIf condition might be a little more complicated than just binding to a specific property. Because the thing I forgot to mention earlier is that condition where you put in some condition here, it can be a property, it can be an Angular expression, it can be a series of expressions. So it could be like some condition and some other condition and some other condition. So it can be a little bit complicated. So you might need to store that so you can reuse it elsewhere in your application. One of the most common times you'll need to store it is if you're binding your ngIf with an observable using the async pipe, because you often want to reuse that asynchronous data in your template. So how would you do that? So one way is that you could not store the value and just reuse that conditional logic in multiple places. So this, again, is going to be the anti-pattern that you don't want to do. So in this case, I have ngIf table data observable pipe async here. And then this is that example I talked about before, where if I have data I want to show a table, and if I don't have data for my table, maybe there was an error, then I don't want to show my table component at all. So in this case, I have table data pipe async, and then I want to reuse that data to bind it to my table component later. So again, I just have table data pipe async again. But as usual, there's a better way. Instead, you can use the as syntax that's built into the ngIf directive and provided to us by the Angular team. So here we can say table data pipe async as data, and then later when I need to reuse that data property, I can just bind it to data below. And the name of data can be anything you want. I could have called this as Michi. I could have called this as Angular Utah. Whatever you want it to be, whatever makes sense in your template, you can do. So that way you can reference it later. But again, let's talk about why this is better. The first 2 reasons are the same as before. It's cleaner, it's easier to understand. And the second is that it keeps all that conditional logic in one place. You don't have to, if you change the name of table data, you don't have to change that multiple places. If this wasn't an async pipe, but maybe it was a complicated expression, you don't have to have that complicated expression in multiple places. So that's nice, keeps your templates nice and clean, easy to read. And the second thing is, for the async pipe specifically, you don't need to create a second unnecessary subscription to the table data observable. You just have the single subscription, and then you reuse the data from that in multiple places. So let's summarize ngIf. First, ngIf directive allows you to control your DOM based on conditional values, which allows you to add and remove elements from your DOM conditionally. And then you can use the else syntax and the as syntax to really take full advantage of all the features provided by the Angular team for ngIf. So next, we're going to talk about ng4, but I do want to pause here real quick and just say, like, does anyone have any questions about ngIf that would be useful to to answer right now. Nope, didn't mean to do that.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So for example, when you do like the ngIf on a div, like
Mhm.
and you have like the else statement,
Mhm.
does that copy also the div as the part of that template, or is it a different?
That would replace the div. So let's go over to that. That's a really good question. So in this case, instead of having the div here, it would replace completely from the start of div to the end of the div, whatever element that ngIf is on, it's going to be completely replaced by the ng template. So if I wanted this to be more one-to-one, I probably should have put, otherwise I want to show this within a div as well. So that was more clear that it completely replaced it.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, that was a good question.
I have a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
Is there ever a time when somebody might want to use hide instead of ngIf? Like, is there a reason why you wouldn't want to use ngIf for something?
I mean, I think there's definitely, you could argue there's probably a case for that. Like maybe if, you know, I had that example where I was like showing and hiding that table or adding and removing that table based on the ngIf. It's very possible that for your situation, you think that your users will constantly be showing and hiding that table really quickly. And it's not worth it for you to destroy it and rebuild it every time, right? So I think it's probably you should know, like, based on your users and your use case, like, does it make sense to destroy this when I want to hide it and to rebuild it when I want to show it? Or is it more cost effective for me to actually just hide it underneath the covers?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Do we have something like an else if condition? We have just if and else, or else if we have?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the first part of that.
Yeah, in JavaScript, we have the else if condition. We have like if, else, else if, else if.
Oh, like I can continuing to chain it?
Yeah, it's kind of a switch condition. Do we have something
Got
like
it.
that?
So there is an ng switch statement, which is not the same as what you're asking. But that's normally what I use in that case if I have like an else if situation. As far as I know, you can't chain other else's to the ng templates, but I think you could if you needed to put another ngIf within the ng template.
That's what I was thinking too.
Yeah.
That sounds really dirty though.
Yeah, I probably would suggest you not do that, but maybe if you need to, but probably the ng switch would be better.
Yeah, switch is the better. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just making sure. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I've gotten in situations like that where I'm like, oh no, I have like an else within this ngIf. Like, what do I need to do here? So that's definitely a tough situation.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, Michi, good question.
Mm-hmm.
On the other block, does it need to be an ID tag? I forgot to ask that before.
Yeah, so that's how it's going to reference the template that you're referencing. So the else is going to have to go to an ng template, and then yeah, you should use the ID tag to reference that other template.
Okay, cool.
All right, cool. Those are a lot of really good questions. Thank you, everyone. All right, if there are no other questions, then we'll move on to NG4. Once I find where that is. All right, cool. All right, so NG4. So this is the second structural directive that we're going to go over today as a group. I didn't add ng switch just for the sake of time, but that is another good one. So the NG4 directive, what is it? It's a directive that's used to iterate over a collection of objects and add an instance of a specified template for each item in that collection. That sounds really technical. All that's really saying is I have an array of items and I want to add the same element for every single item in my array to my DOM. So a really common example of this that we're going to use in this talk is you have a list of to-do cards, right? You have a to-do list. Each card is the same element, right? They're all going to be like my to-do elements or my to-do components. And you want to add, however many of those elements to your DOM as you have to-do items in your to-do item array. So let's look at an example. Okay, no. So this would be an example where you're not using ng4. So I have a list of items. Again, we're using that to-do, that really common to-do list example, because I can't have a tech talk without to-do list items. And so I have my to-do list, and then I have 3 items in my to-do list. The first is walk the dog. The second is go to the gym. The third is write a blog post. So in this example, we immediately can see that we have a lot of repeated code. We have my to-do item repeated 3 times. So that's immediately not really great because our code is repeating itself. And the second is, this is really static. How do I add another to-do item to my list? Like I would have to check out my repo, change the HTML, and then republish my application. That doesn't make very much sense. Users wouldn't be able to use this. This isn't dynamic at all. What's a better way? Using ng4. So in this case, we have the exact same code that we had in that previous example. This was 14 lines of code. It's now a nice, concise 6 lines of code. So here, we're using ng4. We have an array of to-do items, and then we're going to iterate. And for every item in to-do items, we're going to add a my to-do item component to our DOM. And we're using the properties in the item of my to-do items to bind the data to the my to-do item template. So we can do item.title, item.description. So again, we're going to talk about why this is better. So first, it's dry, right? We're not repeating my to-do item over and over. It's dynamic. So now I can have my to-do items can be an array that we get from the server. So it can be specific to every user. You can have like a button in your component, in your component that adds another to-do item to your array. So you can add additional items. So it's nice being more dynamic. We're not static anymore. It's also a lot more easy to extend now. So imagine we want to add a click listener to the my to-do item. Before, when we had 3 of those, you would have had to add that click listener to every single instance. Imagine if you have more than 3, that's going to be really tedious. And also, it's a lot more error prone. It's not uncommon that you might forget one. Now suddenly one of your to-do items is not working like the others. This way, using ng4, everything's consistent. Every single to-do item is going to be built the exact same way as all of the others. So immediately, we're getting a lot of benefits just from using ng4. And like the ngIf, the syntax that the Angular team used here is really clever because it directly mirrors the for-of syntax that we're probably already used to in JavaScript. So you can see here in the for-of syntax, we have for let item of to-do items. And then in this case, we're just console logging item.title, item.description. You'd probably be doing something more advanced if this was actually an application, but you can immediately see the similarities. We have in our HTML template, we have let item of to-do items. It's the exact same syntax, and then we're referencing the items in that that for-of loop the exact same way. Item.title, item.description here. Item.title, item.description here. So like the ngIf, this should be feel really intuitive for developers to use just right out of the gate, which is nice. So that's the basics for ng4. So let's talk about some of the more advanced concepts for ng4. So again, for all of you people that were 2s, you probably already knew how to use the basic properties of ng4, but hopefully some of these advanced concepts will maybe be new to you. So the first thing is variables. Sometimes you might need to know additional information when you're looping through that ng4 and adding those elements to your DOM. You might need to know information about each individual object's position in your array. So some examples for this is you might want to add a different CSS class for every other element. So you think like, alternating the colors of rows in a table. You might want to know the exact index of an object in the array. So that way you can use it in an action. So we're going to have an example for this in a little bit. And you also might want to know if the item is the first or last item in the array. So you might want to add a margin. You could also do that with just CSS, but let's pretend we're doing it with HTML, or maybe like the first or last item in the array has special properties or actions on it that the other ones don't. So maybe you have like a stack and you can only pop if it's the last item. So there's a couple different, these are just some examples, but there are definitely a lot of other examples where you need more information. So how can you get more information? Luckily, the Angular team thought ahead and have exported variables for us to use in our ng4. I'm not going to go over what all of the variables are, but Angular has great documentation on this already. So we're going to look at index as an example, but there are a lot of other variables that I definitely recommend that you look at the documentation, so you can see all the variables that are available. So let's look at index though, and to get more concrete. So in this example, I want to add a delete output to my to-do item. So let's say my to-do item has like a little trash can icon. Whenever you click it, it's going to emit a delete event, and then the person that created the my to-do item can remove that item from the to-do items array. But to remove it, I need to know the exact index of that item so I know what to remove. So in this case, I can use the index variable that's exported from the ng4 by the Angular team, and then I can store it in a variable called I. And this syntax should look pretty familiar because we used a similar syntax in the ngIf where we did ngIf as a variable. In this case, I'm doing index as I. And just like the ngIf before, we could name I anything we want. I'm calling it I here, but you could call it, again, you call it Michi if you wanted, anything that you want. And then we use that I that we store, and we reference it later when we call delete item whenever the delete event is emitted. So this is just one example of how the variables can be really useful. But let's look at how, I gave a couple other examples. So what variables would we use there? So if you want to add a different CSS class for every other element, there you could either use even or odd. So even and is a variable that's exported by the ng4. They'll let you know if the element is in the even position in the array. Odd similarly will let you know if it's in the odd position in the array. So odd being 1, 3, 5, even being 2, 4, 6, so on and so forth. We just saw the example. If you want to use the exact index of your object, you would use the exported variable called index. And if you want to know if it was the first or last item, we have corresponding, there's a variable called first, and there's also a variable called last. So again, definitely recommend that you look at the entire list of variables to see if there's any other variables that would be useful for you as you're iterating through the ng4. So the next thing is data updates. For ngIf, I talked about how data updated right away, but for this one, it's a little bit more complicated. So the ng4 directive is going to track changes that are made to your array and will update the DOM for you immediately whenever a change is detected. So the changes that we'll listen for are new objects being added to your array, objects being removed from your array, or the items in your array being reordered. If any of those actions happen, the DOM will automatically update for you. So we'll, if you add an object, it's automatically going to add a new element for you. If the item's removed, it's automatically going to remove that element for you. That's why that delete function that we had in the previous slide worked, because we removed it from the array so that DOM would just update automatically. And if you reorder, maybe you have like a sorting function, it's automatically going to update that DOM. So that's really great. Right out of the box, it's working for you, and being really smart about those updates. The thing is, oh, sorry, ignore that slide. By default, the changes are tracked using the object identity. So if you're adding or removing elements from the same array, and you're not changing the objects that were in the array when you add or remove, this is going to work for you great. So let's, like, an example of that would be, I have this array. This is my to-do list items from before. I have an object called walk the dog, one for blog post, one for gym. And then just for ease, let's pretend the object ID of the array is 0. The object ID of walk the dog is 1. Blog post is 2. And gym is 3. Again, we don't, as a developer, don't have any control over these object IDs. These are just like the JavaScript IDs. So when I add another new item to this array, which is I have to walk my dog again because I have to take her out at night as well, it's going to have a different object ID. So even though the data of these first two are the same, they're technically pointing to different objects in memory, so they're going to have different object IDs. But because the other ones didn't change, when I add this fourth one, the ng4 loop is going to go through. It's going to look at this first one with is object ID 1. Says like, oh, I already have that. Don't do anything. Object ID 2. Oh, I already have that. Object ID 3. I already have that. It's going to look at object ID 4. Oh, I don't have an element for this yet. It's going to add a new element for walk the dog. That's great, right? Well, if you are Using immutable arrays or objects, you might be rebuilding all of the objects in your array every time you change something. So even though the data of each of those objects is the exact same, you're technically pointing to a new object in memory, which means it's going to have a new object ID. This is going to cause your entire DOM to flash because it has to rebuild each individual element. And that's not great for your users. It's also really expensive. So you don't want to do that. So let's just real quick walk through an example of that. So we have our array from before. But I'm using something like NGRX. When I add a new item to my array, I'm actually going to, everything's immutable, so I have to rebuild all of my objects. So the next value that's emitted from my store is going to look like this. We rebuilt everything, so now everything has new object ID. So, walk the dog, blog post, gym. The data here is the exact same, right? To the user, these are the exact same objects. But to your browser, they're completely different objects. This is object ID 6, 7, and 8 respectively, and object ID 9. So to your NG4 loop, these are going to look like completely different elements. It's going to destroy each of the previous ones and rebuild. So this is where you get that flash that I mentioned, because it thinks it has four new elements and that the 3 it had are removed. So what do you do? This is not great, but using something like NGRX and having immutable data is a really common pattern that people like to use, and that's good to use. So what do you do? Again, the Angular team already thought of a solution for us and gave us a really easy to use track by function. So now what you can do as a developer is you say, hey, instead of tracking each element by the object ID, I'm going to tell you what value you should use to track each element so that you know if the value has changed or not. Generally, there should be some sort of unique ID that's stored with the object. So maybe when you create a new to-do item, you also create a unique ID that's stored in the database. So when you retrieve that to-do item from the database, you also have that unique ID. So even when you rebuild the object, that ID has not changed. That's the key that you need to have here. So looking at our example from before, if we had something like an ID property where every time we created a new to-do item, it had an ID, we could use that in our track by function so that we could immediately tell the ng4 directive, hey, use this ID instead to track these items. That way, when I add that fourth walk the dog, it's not going to do that flicker. So let's look at code of what that would look like. So the first thing you do, you create a track by function in your component. In this case, I called it track by fn. It gets passed in the index of the item in the array, and then also the item itself. So in my case, it's a to-do item. And then you need to return whatever that ID is that you want, whatever that property is that you want to track by. So in my case, I'm going to use the ID. So I just return item.id, and that's it. Really simple. And then in the ng4 directive, I add a new track by property, and then I just reference whatever that function I created was. So in my case, I called it track by fn. And that's all you have to do. Now, when you rebuild all those objects, instead of using the object ID, it's going to use the ID property for each to-do item, and it's not going to have that gross flicker whenever you add or remove objects from your array. So really simple solution. I know, like, I personally was like really intimidated by track by functions for some reason when I first started using Angular and ng4. It felt like this really advanced concept that was something like I didn't want to use, but like now I've realized like it's incredibly easy to use. It's just, again, it's a simple function. You bind it using a couple characters of data, and now everything just works for you out of the box. So if you use something like NGRX, I definitely recommend that you kind of get in the habit of using track by default. All right, so that's it for ng4. So let's summarize that. ng4 directive allows you to iterate over an array and add multiple elements of the same type to your DOM for each item in your array. You can make use of the local variables that Angular provides, such as index, even, and first, to get additional information about the position of each item in your while you're iterating through the ng4 loop. And then you can use the track by function to have better control over how your DOM is going to rebuild when there are changes made to the array that you bind to your ng4. So I have a couple references here. I can share these slides in the comments for the meetup. So we have references to the general Angular structural directive docs, so you can read about those. We have the ngif docs, ng4 docs. I'll actually update this, so it also has ng-switch. Ng-switch is really, you know, how ngif and ng4 mirrored the syntax for the if statement and the for of statement in JavaScript, ngIf is pretty much the same way. It allows you to bind to a variable, and then you have different cases for each property of the variable, and there's even a default statement. So if you're used to using the switch statement in JavaScript, you can use the ng switch state directive really easily. And then also, if you're into reading about things, I think I forgot to mention is that I'm also an NG champion, which means I get to blog with the ngConf team. So I've written 2 blog posts about this. I'm actually doing a series on structural directives. So I'm going to have another blog post on ng switch, and then a couple blog posts on probably ng template, ng container. So definitely check those out if you like to read about things to learn. And in general, definitely encourage you to check out the ngConf blog. There's a lot of other awesome bloggers like Eric on there, and all the content is really cool. So yeah, definitely check that out. That's all I have. Any questions about ng4 or ngIf or anything?
I have a comment.
Yeah.
I've worked with a lot of Angular developers, and so many of them, including myself, have at times forgotten to use trackby. So thank you so much.
I'm telling you, it seems really intimidating at first. I don't know why, but it just does.
I always just forget about it.
Yeah, that's that too. What?
I have a question. So I'm just curious because it's a for of. Is there an implementation that is for in? I don't know. Yeah.
No, that's a good question. So the technical, I think, under the cover hood name for the ng4 directive is actually the ng4 of directive. There is not an ng4 in directive. The way they wrote it, it's almost like they left the door open so that they could add it in. I think I've seen a GitHub issue for it, but as far as I'm aware, there is no ng4 in directive, and there's no actual plans to add one. But if anyone knows otherwise, please correct me.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions for Michi before I take it over for a second?
Yeah, I have a question. In the track by function, we always need to have just one ID, like one field for comparison, or can we have like a combination of? I think it's always should be one field for the comparison.
It could be it can be whatever makes sense to you. So if I wanted, where's my track by function? It's something, it needs to be something that's going to be consistent, and it's going to be unique to that item. So if for me, if my to-do items, if the title was always unique, or if maybe I had a rule that the title and description had to be unique, this could return like item.title plus item.description, right? It could be an array of concatenating a bunch of different properties in the object. It's really, that's kind of, again, something that needs to make sense to you and your data.
Okay, okay.
All right. Well,
awesome.
Have you ever tried extending like ngIf, like inheriting from it? I mean, back in Angular, like 2 or 3 version, I wrote a has permission or has role directive. I tried extending the ngIf, but at the time, I could not get it working. Just inheriting from it. Do you find yourself, if you're creating structural directives, you just start from scratch, or do you actually try extending some of the existing ones?
I'm going to be honest that me and my team, we've only actually made our own structural directive once. For the most part, the ones that are provided have worked well for us. So that's not a problem that I personally have had to tackle. But the time that we've had to make structural directives, we just were able to, I think we just built everything just from scratch and didn't need to extend anything. But that's a good question. I don't know if maybe anyone else here has had that experience.
I can actually jump in on that one because I have created for a previous team exactly what you were talking about. You pass in, an ID of a particular permission or feature ID, and it shows or hides the element based on that. The fun thing about ngIf is if you look at the source code behind it, it's like maybe 10 lines of code. Like the NGF structural directive itself isn't, it just isn't that complex. And so I was actually able to, use the same tools that NGF uses to write my own structural directive from scratch that mirrored that kind of functionality, but plugged into a service to check my permissions or my feature toggles. So that's how I've tackled that problem in the past. And so it is coming from writing that structural directive from scratch. But even if you're writing it from scratch, Angular is still going to give you a ton of tools to be able to accomplish some of the same things that the built-in structural directives do for you. A lot like how we have the Angular CDK, the component development kit that gives us some of the same ways to develop reusable components the way the Angular material library does. They give us some of the same tools under the belt, under the hood to help us build those structural directives too.
Thank you for taking that question for me. that was a really great answer.
Oh, thank you. It helps if you've just like done the exact thing the person is asking for.
Yeah.
So.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you so much. If anyone wants to get in contact with me, I'm on Twitter it's Michi, but with 4 M's. It's like Michi. Or you can also contact me on Medium on those blog posts.
I always thought it was Michi.
It could also be Michi. However you want to say it is fine with me.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Michi. That was an incredible talk. All right. Also, I wanted to remind everyone that I sent out a survey, a little, like, not a survey, but I asked you guys to tell me what topics you wanted to hear about. And a good number of you asked for more basics. And what Michi presented was part of that endeavor for more basics. And I'm really happy she went into more detailed stuff too. But I want you guys to know that the Angular Utah Meetup is here for you. It's here to help you grow. It's here to help you and your friends and even people that you want to see get into tech who may be struggling right now with this difficult economy. It can be a great resource. I know I've invited some people to come. They unfortunately did not show up, but I think that I will keep trying with them. And there's a lot that we can do with our mentoring and inviting people to things like this. So another thing I was going to bring up is, I'm sorry, Michi, I forgot to read your bio, but I will do that for Philip. I'm so sorry.
That's fine.
She's awesome. I sort of made up my own bio for her because she's cool. Then the other thing I was going to say is that if anyone is looking for a job currently or knows that their company is hiring for people, please feel free to use the Meetup's event page or just the Meetup page and write a comment there, or you can tweet it at me and I will announce it for you in the Meetup. But even better, like, I'm going to make sure that I take like 5 minutes at the start of all these to allow people who are looking for talent and people who are looking for jobs to raise their hands and then have a conversation with each other on the side. So I haven't been too great at remembering to do that, but I'm going to add it to my slides so I don't forget, because that's pretty important. So that is it for that. Oh, also, if you have a company that you know would be willing to sponsor one of our meetups, we would like to get more prizes in there so that all of you guys can get prizes, because it's fun and it's awesome. Today we got the Thinkster one, but we're happy to do prizes for any company. So next time Narwhal's giving away a free mug, then let me know. I think I won that actually from Enterprise NG.
You know, I don't have a Narwhal mug, and so I'm actually jealous of all my colleagues and the other folks in the community who have won one already, because I haven't gotten swag one from Narwhal, and I'm mildly bitter about it. So
well, if you could get one if you come to our meetup and you convince your company to do it.
I'll convince them to sponsor, and then I'll attend, and I'll finally have a Narwhal shirt of my own. I can't wait.
Exactly. Well, let me introduce Philip so we can get his amazing content. So Philip Fulcher is a senior engineer with Narwhal and an NX core team member. He works with Fortune 500 clients to modernize their development practices with a mono-repo approach. Philip lives in Colorado with his wife, who is way smarter than him, and has 2 great kids. So here we go. Thank you, Philip, for presenting today.
Absolutely. And since you just brought up companies that are hiring, Narwhal is hiring right now. If you want to hit our site up at narwhal.io/careers, we'd be happy to have some applications come in. We're a completely remote company. We work with a lot of great clients, and everybody gets to spend some of their time working on internal projects like NX and NX Cloud. So I've really enjoyed my time there. I just joined this year. But we are still hiring, and again, like fully remote, working from anywhere, United States, Canada, Europe. I'm happy to talk to you more about that later on if you're interested in putting in an application. All right, so just like Michi did, I'm gonna just ask everybody to real quick in the chat put in just like a yes or a no to the question. Have you worked with NX before? And I'll go ahead and share my screen here. All right. So Eric uses it on everything now, which is great because I do too, but you might expect that from someone who helps build it. So we've got a good mix of folks, some of which who have used it. Probably see more no's than yes, just kind of flipping through there. But that's what I'm here to talk to you about. I saw the recording last month of Preston Lamb's presentation on using the NX affected command for deployment. And I thought this would be a great opportunity to actually talk to you a little bit more about NX and also just sort of dive in a little bit more into some of the things that he was talking about in terms of structure. So what I want to talk to you today is about bringing order to chaos with NX. And specifically, we're going to be talking about organizing code. This is a question that comes up a lot, that especially as projects start small and grow, or you're inheriting a code base and you're not exactly sure where things live. You come onto a new project and you're trying to figure things out. How can we organize our code to account for a flexible foundation going forward and being able to help folks to, discover the code as they come onto a project? Of course, we're going to talk about how NX is going to help us achieve those organizational goals. So if you're not familiar with NX, NX is a set of tools that sort of wraps the Angular CLI. Under the hood, we're still using all of the great tools that the Angular core team has built. But NX sort of builds on top of those to give you a little bit more flexibility, a little bit more power, and some more access to what we consider more modern tools. So for example, NX can very easily enable your project to switch over to using the Jest library to run your unit tests as opposed to Protractor. And so it can really be an enabler to be able to bring in new technology to your project. But at its core, it imposes some organizational tools and methods and a dependency graph based on that organization that I think can help a project of any size. And so I'm going to show you exactly how that works. And then finally, we'll talk more about that dependency graph and affected, because the way we organize our code within NX is actually understood by NX. And so when we make a change in one particular part of our code base, NX actually understands that and can change the tasks that we may run on the code that we've actually affected. So let's start with a brand new project, right? Every new project starts out small and you think you can manage it because you've got a few components. They hook up to some services that call out to a backend. That's going to get you some data and you pull them all in, and life is great because you don't have that much to organize. So you're not that worried about it. But eventually things get bigger and you start to see all of these crisscrossing patterns of like, oh no, I have too many components. I can't, I've got to scroll through this list of components or try to find this service. And I don't know what is dependent on what. What's actually depending on that service up there? Could be multiple things. So looking at the Angular style guide, which is a great resource if you haven't seen it before, it's on the angular.io site. One of the things that they recommend and that we highly recommend as well is first starting by organizing your code by feature. So if there is code within your project that is all interrelated, you know, let's say that it handles the particular code for a particular route, a particular use case within your project, then we organize those all together. So, you know, for example, in feature A, these components are all part of this single route. Those services all call the same backend API. This is a good interrelated piece of code. Feature B handles something that's on a different route or might access an API from a different place. And this is great. And we highly, highly recommend that you think of your code in this way, especially if you've ever come from like an Angular JS background. You might have come across a pattern of actually organizing things by the type of thing they are. For example, putting all your components into a directory called components and all your services in a service directory. And that's okay. But the thing is that typically when you're developing, you are sort of cross-cutting across multiple things. You have to hook up to the back end in a service, and that needs to get pulled in through a container component, which is then going to pass things down into a shared component of some kind. And you have to sort of open up multiple things to be able to work on, open up multiple directories, spend a lot more time searching for the code that you're working on, as opposed to having everything that's interrelated in this one directory. This is good, but it could be better, because some of the things that we start to see here are, even though this has organized things for us, there's no enforcement of that organization. And so, for example, there's no way for me to say, using the standard Angular CLI tools and a directory structure, it's very hard for me to say that this component over in feature B can't depend on this service. The best you can do is, you know, have a company culture, a team culture that says, make sure you're not depending on anything that's outside of your feature. But then you have to make sure that you look for those in code reviews. And I can tell you that if you ask developers nicely to do something and you don't enforce it, the next time the sprint end rolls around and they're trying to get their story closed, you're going to start to see things like this. They know they shouldn't, and it's not even ideal. But the system allows them to do it, and it helps them to get done a little bit faster. And so they're going to break this organization and say, you know, I'll fix that next sprint. And spoiler alert, they're not going to fix it next sprint. That's going to be a problem for a long time. So let's talk about how NX can begin to help us with some of these problems, both to give us some slightly better tools for organizing things and also to be able to enforce some of the organizational decisions that we've made. So for NX, we're going to be able to define libraries with explicit APIs. So rather than just having a directory that's full of code that can be imported from anywhere, we're actually going to break our code base down into small units that are going to only have particular pieces of code exposed. So you can't just import anything out of my library. I have to tell you exactly what is able to be imported from this particular library. We're going to talk about this dependency graph. And so a dependency graph will be able to track which of these libraries rely on the other ones and actually draw a path through your code to be able to show you sort of end to end, you know, this shared component is used by this feature, which is consumed by this application. And then once we understand that dependency graph and we understand that certain code changes affect particular parts of that dependency graph, we can actually begin to only run those tasks against code that's been affected. Again, last month, Preston did a great job talking about how the affected command can help you with your CI, that you only run unit tests against things that have been affected and things like that. So first off, if we're going to use libraries to organize an NX, we have to know what a library is. And like all good development terms, the word library has about 50 different meanings depending on where you are. So within NX, we specifically mean that that's a small unit of code with a well-defined public API. And what that looks like is this. Your feature library is going to have something like some components. Here's our services. This is very similar to what we talked about before. But the difference is that for each of these libraries, we're going to have something that is defined as exported. So we're going to be able to say that this service is exported and this service from this library over here can depend on this one over here. So for our example today, because we always have to have a fun example when we're dealing with these things, right? This is the part in every presentation where I reveal to the entire world that I am a super nerd and I love the Pokemon trading card game. And I have actually seen some of your backgrounds in Zoom, and I think there's also some Pokemon fans out there. So the sample app that we're going to be dealing with is going to show off some cards from the original set from Pokemon trading card game. And it's also going to be able to display just some decks. And this is using a real API. There's a real Pokemon card game API out there that's pulling in these images for us. So when we have a library, let's sort of look at, more exactly what this library within NX looks like. So let's say that we had a shared component library for our Pokemon card game app. And this was something that displayed the summary of a card in that GIF that you saw. This is what's displaying the image that's in there. We first have a directory structure where the library itself is given a very specific name. It has its source code, and then it has some configuration files. So we can have separate tsconfig, we can have separate unit test configuration files. This particular piece of code is completely isolated from anything else that's actually within our workspace. We also have a readme.markdown for being able to document things. And probably most importantly, we have this index.ts. So in this index.ts, we define what's actually exported from this particular library. And in this case, all we export is the module. So when you're ready to use the shared UI card summary component, you can import that module. And when you're importing it from somewhere, you can use this nice syntax where we begin with a workspace name, which in this case is an abbreviation for Pokemon Trading Card Game. And then the directory that this library is actually in. So rather than having to deal with, a lot of nested directories or relative paths to directories, you always import it from the exact same place, no matter where you are. You could be 3 levels deep in another library and you would still import from this library using this exact same string. And that's accomplished using paths in tsconfig.json at the root of your workspace. Some of you may have seen that approach before. It's heavily utilized within NX to accomplish this. Once we have things divided up into libraries and we have a directory structure that sort of isolates our code, the next thing that we want to do to that is begin to add a little bit more meaning to our libraries, because it's really nice to have that isolated unit of code with its own API that's very well defined, but we can add a little bit more meaning to it with a set of classifiers. And by classifiers, we're typically talking about 2 different things. We're talking about scope. And if you're not familiar with the idea of scope, or it's sometimes referred to as a domain, especially if you're looking at like domain-driven design, this is a logical grouping, a business use case. It is a way of saying this is a major area and focus of your code. So when we were talking about feature libraries earlier, feature libraries kind of get rolled up under a scope. And so in our example, since we're going to have a lot of work that is very specific to Pokemon cards, that's going to be a scope for us. And we're going to have another scope that kind of handles our decks. And within those scopes, we're probably going to have multiple routes, multiple feature libraries, but they're all going to be focused around this idea of cards and decks. And sometimes that's really easy to sort of define within your business use case. Sometimes it takes a little bit of thinking to sort of suss out what are the sort of major areas of responsibility, major use cases within my project. But we'll start with card and decks within our example. A couple of other scopes that we see in every project are going to be core and shared scopes. And these are things that don't belong to a single use case, but are more general to the project. So we have a scope of core. Core are things that don't belong to anyone, but are essential to your application loading. These are going to be things that are almost always eagerly loaded. And if they don't load, then your application is kind of kaput. So this is where we're going to see things like authentication, authorization, any sort of environment configuration that you might need. Those are going to be core libraries within that core scope. And then shared are going to be things that are shared across multiple domains, but aren't necessarily essential to the application running. So things like your shared component library, some shared services that might access the same backend across multiple domains, and things like that. So that's one way that we can classify a particular library, what scope it's a part of. The other thing that we can say about a library is we can give it a type. And this really defines that particular library's purpose and usage. So some of the examples are UI, data access, and feature. And we've talked a lot about feature libraries. So we should have a good idea of what feature libraries are in terms of a type. UI and data access are more particular, and we'll sort of get into some of those types here. So when we look at the scope of a particular library, we're looking at the workspace that we're going to open up here in a few minutes and explore. But we use the scope as a directory structure within our libs to be able to group together all of our libraries. So you can see that there's that data access auth library. That's part of our core. That's really essential to us. We have some shared data access, some models, and that UI card summary library that's sitting under shared. And then here's our cards and decks. So we use scope at a very high level, and it helps to group together these libraries at a very rough level. When we're talking about type, we're going to append the name of that type to the beginning of every library. And that's for two reasons. Number one, it helps with discoverability. If you're assigned a new task within a new workspace and they say, hey, you need to go work on accessing the back end, you know, hey, I'm looking for a data access library within a particular scope. So this helps you to discover which library that you actually need to be working on and can kind of give you an idea of what the purpose is. Here's the sort of code that I should add to this. The other thing, by actually adding that type to the beginning of the library, since things are sorted alphabetically, it's going to pull all of those libraries of the same type together. So this is a very simple example. But if we were to imagine we added more and more feature libraries, all of our feature libraries are going to be alphabetized to sort of be in this central region, while all of our data access libraries are at the top. So again, it sort of helps us seek out and find the particular piece of the workspace that we should be working on at any given time. So let's go and talk about those types a little bit more, because we have a lot. We have about 5 that we typically see in typical use cases. So we've talked about a library with a type of feature, which is addressing a specific business use case. These are typically container elements, and so that's referring to the container presentational component pattern. Container elements typically have injected services. They understand state, they understand where data comes from, and they're going to inject those things down into presentational components. Presentational components typically having inputs and outputs that define their behavior rather than having something that's injected through the constructor. The next type of library that we have is the presentational components, which is exactly what I just went through. So we sort of have these two separations of a UI library is going to be very reusable because all you have to do is provide the values that you want on the inputs and receive events from outputs. And that can be used in a lot of different places. You may get the same data model from multiple different places and be able to inject it into the same UI library component. To go along with that, we'll often see a data access or a state type library. And this depends on whether you're directly accessing a backend through a service, or if you're using something like NGRX or GraphQL. This is going to interact with the backend and store state. We have models, which are going to be interfaces for data structures. So especially if you have something that's going to, when you're getting data back from your backend, that model probably needs to be defined in a place where both the data access libraries can use it so that they can define the response that's coming back from them. But your feature library also needs to know about that model because it's going to get that model back out of the state or through the services that you provide from your data access libraries. Finally, we'll see util, which is common utilities and services. This, you want to stop this from becoming a catch-all of, I can't decide what this is just a utility library. But you'll have a few use cases where there's a pure function that you want to share amongst multiple places. And this is really the place to put that. We can use NX to add that scope and that type richness to every library in more ways than just naming the library. We can tag them within a JSON file that's at the root of every NX workspace. So you can see here for cards feature search, that's going to be in the scope of cards. It's going to be a feature library, and it's going to handle our search feature. So we tag that with a type of feature to indicate that the type of the library, and then scope of cards. So once we have all of these libraries tagged by saying exactly what type and scope they are, we can actually begin to further constrain the behavior of them. So previously we talked about how important it was that each of these libraries has a public API. You can only import the things that are actually exported from that particular library. Well, we can also begin to say that particular types of libraries can only import from other libraries that are tagged correctly. So let's take a look at this very particular constraint here, which is a particularly common one. That type feature. That type feature library is going to need a lot of things. You know, it's going to need shared UI. It probably has some utility functions. It needs to know about that model. It may even depend on another feature. You know, if this library has routes in it, it may need to import that feature to go to a nested route. And it's going to need the data access. So this constraint is basically saying, you know, we can import from just about anything. But if we look at our data access type, we're going to be much more specific with it and say that can only import from utility libraries, model libraries, and data access libraries. And that's going to make sure that when we say this library is just for data access, it's going to stay just for data access. We're not going to import things like UI components into this library. That's not that library's purpose. And so we can actually stop folks from making that decision of, you know, I really just want to put this component here because it's easier for me today. We can actually say, no, that library needs to stay purposeful just for data access. And we can define a lot more of these constraints based on how we want to enforce the differences between those types. So if we go back to our example earlier of talking about dividing our code into libraries and what we can't accomplish when we just have things organized by directories, All of these red lines can show ways that we now enforce the organization of our code. So not only are we well organized, we're going to have a better shot at staying well organized into the future, because that's often the problem that we run into as we grow and expand and add features. We start off strong, we make some good decisions about how things should be organized, and then we sort of drift over time. This is going to help keep everybody honest. And so these red lines sort of represent the things that we have now constrained within our organization. We know that this feature library can't depend on a component out of this feature library because it hasn't exported it. The same thing with these services. This service over here in this data access library has actually not been exported. So this exported service is able to be consumed by these other ones. And we're making a lot of progress towards making sure that everything stays nice and neat and organized. And when it stays organized in this way, we can better understand the dependency graph and how our different libraries depend on one another. All right, so I'm going to jump out into VS Code and actually show you what this NX workspace looks like. But before I do, how about I stop and see, are there any questions before we go forward? All right, so I don't hear anybody chiming in. I can't see the chat right now.
Nothing so far. Just
right.
People saying that it's very clear so far.
All right, awesome. So let's bring even more clarity. I always like to see code before I agree that I understand anything. So what we'll have here is we're just going to pop over into VS Code. And can everybody sort of see this? Can I get like thumbs up in the cameras if you can read that comfortably? Awesome. All right. So this is what our library structure looks like in an NX workspace. If you're coming from an Angular CLI background, you're probably used to seeing a single source directory at the root of your workspace. This separates things into apps and libraries. So apps tend to stay extremely lean. You can see within this application, it's really just this single application component, and it has some routes defined that actually import these other feature modules. Our libraries begin to look like this. We were looking at our scopes earlier of card, core, dex, and shared. And then here's all of our libraries that live there. Inside of our nx.json is where we can tag all of those libraries. So you can see we've got all of our libraries nice and tagged up. Our angular.json has all of the metadata for all of our libraries. This, coming from an Angular CLI background, again, if you only have one application, this tends to be a pretty short file because you only have builder configurations for a single application. You can see that this is much bigger in an NX workspace because we have this project type of libraries that we can define individual tasks for and architects and builders and things like that. So in our tslint.json is where we define a lot of these constraints. So our type feature, this is sort of the screenshot that I shared. We can begin to say that if we have a type of app, apps can depend on all of these other things, but we probably also want to say that our libraries can't depend on an app. We don't want to make that mistake, right? That's a very easy mistake that folks make of there's sort of an anti-pattern that we've seen before where, especially if you have some environment configuration inside of your application, a library needs to get access to that. And that's something that we want to avoid. And so we can say that, no one can actually depend on a application. You can only depend on things that are typed with these library types. Okay, so those are sort of our constraints. And let's see what happens if we try to violate one of those constraints, okay? So we have a constraint that says, if you're in the scope of cards, you can only depend on things that are in core, shared, and cards. And then if you're in dex, core, shared, and dex. So you shouldn't be able to depend on a library from cards if you're within a scope of Dex. So let's see if that's actually, sure.
Josh Toon from the chat asked, I am late. Those app dependencies, are those auto-generated or do we have to make them manual?
Dependencies are going to be picked up automatically. Tags do have to be added manually. And I'm actually going to cover that in just a little bit.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. So we have these tags and we do have to create the constraints ourselves as well. Because again, what it comes down to is these tags are just strings and NX can't really impose meaning on just strings. We as engineers, as developers have to bring that meaning to the table using that tag. Okay, so let's go back to, okay, so we have this recent Dex feature library. And let's say that we wanted to be just a little naughty, okay? And we wanted to bring in something from the cards domain over here. So let's see what happens. We'll go over to Pokemon TCG and we'll actually flip into cards and try to go to that feature search. What's it gonna say? Oh, we've got a yellow squiggle from TS Lent. A scope tagged with scope Dex can only depend on libs tagged with scope core, scope shared, and scope Dex. So that's exactly what we set. And if once we run our lint over CI, then we're going to get this warning. We can turn this into an error so that you can't do it at all. And this is going to help us know, you know, I've violated some of the organizational agreements that we've made. Okay. So we can enforce that constraint. Let's do a little bit of visualization. So I said that NX can understand the dependency graph. Once it understands all of these imports and exports coming from different libraries, what can it understand about that? Well, one of the commands that we get from NX that we don't have in the Angular CLI is the depth graph. And so if we do NX depth graph, we'll bring up a browser here, and this is going to list all of the projects that we have. And if we start selecting them, then it's going to draw the dependency graph for us. So this application, a dotted line indicates lazy loads. So it lazy loads these features, and then these features depend on these features. And especially since we've used our directory structure to define our scope, we have this option up here to group by folder. So now we have nice, neat colored separation between, okay, what are the different scopes of my workspace and how do they depend on each other? So this can help with discoverability. This is a great way to introduce a new developer to your team to sort of show them the structure of some of this code and how they might be working on it. We can also focus on a particular library. So if we wanted to know just about this feature library that we've been working on, we can, number one, we can see that our cards domain completely disappeared because there's no connection between the Dex, the libraries in the Dex scope and our libraries in our cards scope. So that's really nice. Once we understand that dependency graph, we can begin to discover what is actually affected by our changes. So if we went over to this recent Dex container and, you know, there's actually another piece of information on this deck that I'm not displaying right now, and that's the deck.created. Okay, so we've added that change, and if we go over and look at, if we go over and look at our changes here in our GitHub, we can see we've impacted this feature recent Dex library. If I run now NX affected lint, this is going to lint Dex feature recent Dex and Pokemon TCG because that's all that's been affected by this change. It's not going to run the lint command over any other projects because they haven't been affected by this change. And the way it's doing that is comparing the dependency graph between our main branch and the branch that we're out on right now, or any uncommitted changes that we might have. So great, all of our projects lint right now. And the other thing that it'll do for us is actually cache those results. So as soon as we've run it once, it's going to detect whether we've made any changes since the last time we ran lint. So if I try to run this exact same command again, you notice it ran almost instantaneously. So, and we have this little line here that's probably pretty hard to read across Zoom. It's hard to read on my screen. NX read the output from cache instead of running the command for 3 out of 3 projects. So as we go along and we're making more focused changes on a particular library, if we're using that affected command, we can make sure that we're only running tasks against code that's actually been affected. Just like before, we can also run affected depth graph. And so it's the same sort of command as before, except now it's highlighting the changes that have actually taken place in our code. And if we bring back everything else, we can understand sort of the place of the changes that we've made within them. Now, like someone asked, you do have to do a lot of this work manually, and you kind of have to remember, okay, the scope is a directory, and I also have to add tags when I create the library. And oh boy, that's a lot of work, and it's a lot to remember, and it's maybe not something you want to have every team member on your team having to constantly go through training and documentation and remembering. So NX also gives us the ability to create workspace schematics. And if you've worked with schematics in Angular CLI, you know they're not the most straightforward thing to work with, but we've made them really easy in NX. So what NX can do with a workspace schematic is have a piece of code that can run an external schematic in a very specific way. So if you were creating a NX library, you know, sort of the standard way, and very much like you would use the Angular CLI, you might do NX. We use the NX CLI as opposed to NG, but we, you know, would do something like generate narwhal Angular library, and then we would have to give it its name, you know, just new. We might, to define that scope, we would have to put that into a directory. Let's say it went into cards, and then we'd have to do something like tags equal to scope cards type. This is a lot. And no one's saying that this isn't a lot. This is very hard to remember, and it can be hard for developers to do this consistently. Whoops, I misspelled cards. Oh man, did anyone catch it during the code review? If we use a schematic, instead of doing that, we can write this schematic that will accept in, you can see in this schema.json that there are certain properties. The name of a library, its scope, which is coming from an enum. So your scope can only be these certain things. And then there's a type that's defined here. If we look at index, what it's doing is calling an external schematic. So at narwhal Angular, and then there's that library schematic, same thing that we were calling down here. But then it's passing in the name that we give it. It determines what the directory is based on the scope that we gave it. And it's actually created all the tags for us. So rather than you having to remember what all of these things are, we can use more naturally named things like the library name, the scope, and the type. We also provide a VS Code plugin called NX Console. And these workspace schematics plug right into that. So if I go to generate here, and go to workspace schematic library, I actually get this really nice little visual interface for putting in my library name. I have a drop down of the scopes that are actually valid and types. If you give developers something that's this easy to do it right every single time, they're more likely to do it. And that's the goal of a lot of the tools within NX, is to make the right thing to do the easy thing to do. So we can have a lot of power. It does take some forethought and some work to get into these things, but I can also tell you, I was able to throw together this example in an afternoon. You know, it doesn't take a lot to sort of apply these to a relatively small workspace. If you have a lot of libraries and you don't have these things, it's obviously going to take some more time, but I guarantee you it's going to be worth it to be able to organize things consistently and to be able to move forward into the future, making sure that those organizational goals are met. All right, so that was the workspace tour. If you want to learn more about NX, you can go to our documentation at nx.dev. We also have a YouTube course that will walk you through setting up a new workspace and a lot of the things that we just talked about. We also have a free book that talks about some of the sort of best practices that we see within NX and also within Angular. And you can go to this site here and check that out. I'll provide all these links on Twitter later on, or we can get them in the description of the video. And always reach out. We have a community page that's available at nx.dev. And this is going to tell you all the things that you need to know. We have a community Slack where you can ask questions. I'll make this a little bit bigger. We've got a community Slack. Every 2 weeks, we do NX office hours where we hop on YouTube and folks can ask questions live and get answers from the NX core team. You can follow us on Twitter, and we have a newsletter. So thank you very, very much for your time. I really hope that you learned some more about how to organize a workspace, how NX can help you to make that more efficient and consistent, and how you can run tasks less. I can't tell you how much time I save every single day not having to run every single unit test within my workspace. I only run the unit tests that are impacted by my changes. Does anybody have any questions? Do we have some time for questions?
Yeah, we absolutely do. Go ahead and take 10 minutes for questions if you need it.
Sure.
And we do have some questions in the chat. Josh Toon has our first one. I have one. And
okay.
Then we can go from there.
Sure. Can you read those for me?
Oh, Josh is going to present it himself.
Okay, great.
My first question, you talked a lot about TS-Lint. You know, with NG11 now, they're not doing TS-Lint, they're doing ES-Lint.
Mm-hmm. Yep, everything that I showed you also works with ES-Lint.
Oh, that's great. That's awesome.
Yeah, we're really excited to move on to NX or to ES-Lint from TS-Lint. So we're pushing very, very hard to make sure that we can support all the use cases for ES-Lint as opposed to TS-Lint.
Nice. And one last question was, I saw that IDE form that you were showing.
Sure.
Pretty cool. Do you guys have support for JetBrains too?
We don't directly support JetBrains, and that's strictly because of the size of the team that we are. We just don't have the resources right now to be able to support that officially. Within the community, though, there are actually 2 different plugins for JetBrains that will have a similar UI like this. I'm not sure that I have links to them off the top of my head, but I think you can find those pretty easily.
All right. Hey, well, thank you very much for that. I enjoyed it.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Okay, I had a question about, the thing I wrote it down in the chat so I'd remember what my question was.
Well, don't you know everything about NX already? It's like your favorite.
It is. That's why whenever I get one of you guys, I try to struggle you with questions.
You're just trying to get free consulting work. I see what's up.
You know exactly how expensive you are. Oh, can you save a schematic from the NX dev console in the VS Code extension? Like, you know how you said you could just configure it in the schematic file?
Right.
This is sort of a feature request if it's not a real thing. Can we make it so that I could just fill out like a generate schematic and then click save as schematic?
You mean generate workspace schematic? Oh no, where is it? I called my shot and then I can't find it. Here we go. So if you generate Narwhal workspace schematic, this will give you a name. Let's just call it new. Once this comes out, then we should have. Oh, I didn't actually run it. I did that with the dry run. So it will create the index.ts and the schema.json for you. I can't say right now that we have anything more fully featured than that, but it at least lays out, okay, here's the first thing that you might do. And actually, this is what our base schematic looks like for creating libraries like this, along with your schema.json. So it's not as easy as being able to say, I want to generate a schematic like this, and you just punch in the names. But the fun thing is, I bet you could write a schematic that writes that schematic for you. And potentially someone in the community has already done it.
I kind of want to do it now.
Do it.
I want to go to like generate a module and then have it like pre-filled out and then click generate the schematic.
We have a ton of plugins within the community. Just earlier this year, we really expanded our support for the community being able to add functionality like that, where NX is very opinionated about certain things, and we have no opinion about certain other things. And we kind of want to keep it that way. We want to draw a boundary of these are the things NX knows. These are the things that NX is responsible for. And so when you start to get into those really specific things about like, how should you create a schematic or you know, what options should we give? We tend towards providing an official solution, which is, you know, fully featured but unopinionated, and then allow the community to start to fill in those things. So I would actually love to see that plugin for you. I can't wait for your PR. I'll be checking back on you.
All right. Anybody else have any more questions? All right, well, I'm going to move into the quiz portion of our event. And thank you so much, Philip. I know it must have taken a lot of work. I know you mentioned it took an afternoon just to write that, which, yeah, using NX made that faster than it could have been. But it's still a lot of work to prepare these talks. And so thank you, Philip. Thank you, Michi. This was an excellent, just totally awesome event. Before we jump into the quiz, I want to let all of you know, and Michi is part of the ones organizing this, we are having a Tri-City Angular competition between meetups. And this will be between, well, the Utah State, right? But anyone who's in this call, like anybody who comes to our meetup, even if you're not from Utah, you can participate too. We need at least 4 contestants to enter. And then we're also going to have Angular San Diego, which is the one Michi's from. And then we're also going to have Angular Portland, which is it Sam Jeline or no, it's, yeah, it is Sam. And it's also Brian Love's meetup. So anyway, it's going to be a blast. I tried to get Ward Bell to announce for us, but he was busy. We'll get Joe Ames instead. He's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
So without further ado, I am going to share my screen. Actually, let me move this so that you don't see yourselves. If you're interested in, and that event, by the way, is next month. What day was it on, Michi?
November 16th at 6 p.m. Pacific, I think.
Okay. So if you're interested in participating as part of our meetup, please let me know. Just hit me up ahead of time. We only have 4 contestants, but that doesn't mean you can't just join for fun and for the networking as well. So we're using Remo for that, which is a really awesome digital conferencing tool. And that's been donated by some awesome conference. What was it called?
In Cascadia JS.
Cascadia JS, yeah. Thank you.
Gotcha.
All right. So